Fascism. Both Mussolini and Hitler made state planning commission, the Charter of Labor in Italy, and the Reich Economic Chamber in Nazi Germany. The idea is that private industry still exists, but subordinated to nationalist goals. The Reich Economic Chamber required businesses to join sector-specific chambers. Chambers reported directly to the government, which set production quotas, price controls, and mandatory reinvestment plans. Labor strikes were also banned, meaning workers and corporations were subordinated to the nationalist state. This lended itself to public-private collaboration with lucrative government contracts for those aligned with national goals. Volkswagen was originally a state-backed private company, and Fanta was also made in Nazi Germany. The German Coca-Cola branch couldn't receive syrup from the US due to wartime embargo. They kept the factory running and repurposed existing ingredients to create Fanta. Under fascism, your chair factory is still privately owned, but the government tells you what to do. The surplus generated in your company might go to government projects like military spending, and your workers have no say.
Slavery.
The owner of a plantation receives 100% of the surplus and pays the worker only that needed for their subsistence. Ownership is completely private, and it's enforced by a state, which protects that private property. Plantation owners willfully distribute some of their surplus to that state for security forces that could capture escaped slaves, ensure existing slave compliance, etc.
Feudalism.
Under feudalism, serfs were bound to the land. Their kids would still be bound to that land. If a noble sold that manor, that estate, that land to another noble, the serfs would still have to be on that land. They can't leave without the Lord's permission, they can't marry without the Lord's permission, and they don't actually own the land that they work on. These serfs would farm, producing food, grain for themselves, their families, for their own subsistence. Now what they produce beyond that surplus beyond what's needed for them and their family's subsistence, would go to the Lord. The shops on the estate also belonged to the noble. If you were a serf and wanted to process your grain at the local mill, that mill also belonged to the noble, and you had to pay a rent. Private ownership by nobles, security service protection by the kingdom, which acts as the overarching state. Let's jump straight into neoclassical economics, which is the dominant political ideology in America today. In short, neoclassical economics is laissez-faire capitalism, private property, markets, and a state which protects private property. The philosopher Slavoj Žižek discusses as the utopian core of neoclassical economics, which you might be surprised to hear. They often talk about socialists as being utopian, communists, those who want to go beyond capitalism. But within capitalism, there's a utopian kernel. The promise is that if you have laissez-faire capitalism, capitalism without regulation, without interference, free markets, private property interactions, a state protecting it, and no regulation or intervention, the promise is that the maximal wealth creation in the society possible will happen, and that interactions in markets as social sites would produce a Pareto optimal equilibrium of conflicting interests. So maximal wealth creation and the best equilibrium of conflicting interests. This is the promise. Neoclassical economics, capitalism as such, is known for boom and bust cycles, like the Great Depression. And when that happens, people look for solutions that will avoid mass suffering. A former neoclassical economist came up with some of these solutions called John Maynard Keynes. Basically, he said that we can still have wealth generated through capitalism with markets and private property, but let's just tax and redistribute some of that surplus into welfare, like education, healthcare, and so on. Basically compensate for social ills generated by laissez-faire capitalism through some kind of state intervention, which rather than controlling industries acts as a separate body, taxing and redistributing based on social needs. Let's pull off the band-aid. I'm gonna have to put Marxist-Leninist communism in the way that it's manifested, basically Soviet-style communism, in the B tier. The ideal of communism is a stateless society. Engels talks about the state withering away. There's a notion of workers, the proletariat, forming a kind of state of their own, an organization that will take over the bourgeois power structure, dismantle it, and then it will naturally wither away. And what would be left is councils of workers democratically coordinating with each other. But practically speaking, that didn't happen. Soviet-style communism entailed centralized control over production. The class structure within an enterprise is very similar to capitalism. Lenin, leader of the Russian Revolution, uses the term state capitalism. This means instead of having a board of directors, a minority of decision makers controlling the masses of workers, coordinating their production and what is done with the surplus generated, committees of state officials act as the boards of directors who give top-down decision making to the masses of workers within these enterprises. This new bureaucratic class, acting as the state capitalists with centralized control over production, just as harm in its social effects as laissez-faire capitalism as such. China claims to have socialism with Chinese characteristics. This means Marxist-Leninism adapted to the geopolitical conditions of China. There's a strong state, which has state capitalist industries, which owns a percentage of some private industries, and which generally has many partnerships with the private sector. Special economic zones were set up for the private sector to flourish. State capitalist-led production, along with the strong state overseeing the whole economy, allowed for a redistribution of wealth and a reinvestment of the surplus generated in the society into living standards. According to the World Bank Group, over the past 40 years, around 800 million people have been lifted out of poverty in China. So that's A tier. Traditional socialism. This traditional socialism included a greater degree of participation for workers. The reason the experiment in Yugoslavia is above Soviet-style communism is that workers had more control over the surplus. Workers elected councils in their workplaces, and those worker councils controlled workplace decisions and determined what to do with the surplus collectively. Decentralized enterprises, democratic decision-making. Why did it fail? Decentralization is good, but that's part of why it failed. The lack of coordination between all these enterprises and councils led to self-interested decisions from all of these firms. This meant overproduction in some areas, shortages in others, just a lack of coordination and long-term planning. There were regional economic disparities. Some parts of Yugoslavia kept more surplus than others. Tito suppressed nationalist movements. There were ethnic tensions. The enterprises borrowed heavily from Western lenders. In the 1980s, debt skyrocketed, and the International Monetary Fund imposed austerity, meaning cut public spending, increase taxes, and reduce social services to reduce budget deficits. Internal economic inequality worsened, and so did ethnic tensions. Because they actually tried, because they achieved worker-controlled surplus to some extent, despite their lack of coordination, I have to put them in the A tier. Now, what if I told you we could have worker-controlled surpluses, workplaces based on democratic decision-making without a state, and that for the sake of long-term planning and economic efficiency, all of these independent decentralized firms could coordinate through a federation. Federations maintain independent autonomy while allowing for broad-scale coordination between many parties. This actually happened in Catalonia, Spain during the Spanish Civil War. Workers took over factories and industries. Every firm was managed collectively by workers who acted as their own boards of directors, collectively determining what and when and how to produce and what is done with the surplus generated. Peasants abolished landlords and shared farmland. In Aragon, 450 plus villages formed self-managed agricultural collectives, distributing food based on need. Worker councils and local assemblies made all decisions collectively, and these worker councils were coordinated through federations, allowing for long-term planning and large-scale coordination. Their Federación Anarquista Ibérica, it coordinated independent worker-led factories and farms, and organized millions of workers in decentralized but cooperative planning. 450 villages operated under this anarchist communist structure, pooling resources without landlords or bosses, and production was coordinated between villages, and surplus food was sent to urban areas for free. Those of you who have studied history know that they were crushed by the Franco dictatorship in Spain. Despite that, they survived successfully for some time. Their anarchist militias fought against fascist forces while operating democratically within the ranks. Even in the army, officers were elected, not appointed. Fascist forces, like Franco's army, crushed it. Soviet-backed communists favoring a strong state opposed it. And a lack of significant military support for these workers is also a factor. Decentralized, democratic enterprises in federative coordination with each other. This is peak democracy, and we've yet to make it fully manifest. In anarcho-communism, land is not owned by individuals, but by the community as a whole. The whole community acts as stewards of the land and of the public resources for collective benefit. People have the right to use land, but not to exclude others from it permanently or accumulate land for personal wealth. Because of this community stewardship and responsiveness to community needs, land is used based on need and function, not profit. Local councils make decisions about land use, while federations coordinate across large areas. With the advent of artificial intelligence, we could even have automated production centers collectively maintained by worker councils and community assemblies. Full participation for workers and full democratization of the economy. Hopefully this video was useful. Feel free to discuss in the comments about economic democracy. Salam.